Breaking news crossing the wires right now. The feds are subpoenaing former Congressman Pete Sessions, all over interactions with Rudy Giuliani and his indicted associates. This coming from the Wall Street Journal moments ago. The Wall Street Journal reports it is part of the broader federal criminal probe that now includes Rudy Giuliani. They're seeking documents from Sessions related to the business dealings that Giuliani had with these individuals connected to Ukraine, as well as specifically efforts to oust the U.S. ambassador and interactions between Sessions, Giuliani, and 4 of Giuliani's associates who were, of course, indicted. This news comes as right now Democrats are meeting behind closed doors in the Congress about what they're going to do and potentially impeaching Donald Trump. And that's not all. Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Giuliani, under criminal investigation over Ukraine. Today, he's getting hit from all sides, damning new reporting about his criminal liability and how it is weakening Donald Trump's hand in the broader impeachment probe. That's not all. Confirmation from Giuliani himself that he received $500,000 just last year to consult for a Ukrainian company, which was co-founded by, yes, one of these indicted Ukrainian-linked associates, who was, of course, in the middle of this issue that is also being probed by the congressional impeachment investigators. So right there, that's a lot. The timing of the payment suggests that Giuliani was earning this money around the very same time that he was working with these men who've now been arrested in this pursuit, among other things, to try to get a foreign government to go after Joe Biden. The feds scouring any links that Giuliani had and what the business was all about. Now, the prosecutor's office that he once ran, the Southern District, also examining his personal finances, according to the Wall Street Journal. Back in Washington, a flood of damaging information about Giuliani emerging. A diplomat testifying that he warned colleagues in March about Giuliani's role in a separate disinformation campaign that was trying to help oust the ambassador. Another advisor revealing she raised concerns directly with White House lawyers at the direction of ousted National Security Advisor John Bolton, who, of course, made some waves today, calling Giuliani a walking hand grenade. So you have the heat bearing down on the person who's supposed to deflect the heat from Donald Trump, as more and more impeachment witnesses are clearly rejecting Donald Trump's attempt to create a Stonewall, and they are starting to spill the tea. Now, Giuliani is not talking lately. We, of course, have seen him on Fox News, but he's saying he's not going to go under oath right now. Take a listen to him talking to ABC, talking about a congressional subpoena. I should mention also there's an official working on the impeachment inquiry that tells NBC News that Giuliani will ultimately have to be forced to consider whether what he does in stonewalling will become evidence of obstruction against, yes, Donald Trump, the man he's trying to defend. So what happens now? Where does the investigation go? And who might turn on who? We have some very special guests on the Giuliani of it all and how it connects to impeachment and the cabinet. A former SDNY prosecutor and a cabinet official. New subpoenas in the Giuliani probe, new heat on Giuliani. And as promised, we're back with a former SDNY prosecutor, Miriam Baer, and Robert Reich, a former labor secretary in the Clinton administration and the author of The Common Good. Nice to see you both.
Good to see you.
Robert Reich, what do you see in the foreign policy of this? How unusual is it and how potentially criminal is it to have someone basically trying to pass themselves off as their own Secretary of State?
Well, all right, the issue here is that presidents have secretaries of state who go through a process to get not only nominated and confirmed to the Senate, but also take an oath of office to the people of the United States, not to the president, but to the people of the United States. This Secretary of State role is extremely important. And Donald Trump has essentially appointed Rudy Giuliani as his own shadow Secretary of State. Giuliani has been going all around the world, making all kinds of deals. We are beginning to find out what kind of deals they are. We know that in Ukraine, Giuliani has been involved in trying to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. This is not necessarily something new. I mean, we know that Donald Trump has directly done it.
I'm not asking you if it's new. I'm saying, given your work inside a cabinet, is this normal? Is it abnormal? Is it
it's completely abnormal. No, it's completely abnormal, and it may be criminal.
Miriam?
So the world for Mr. Giuliani has changed remarkably in even just a week. It's one thing to say, well, you were acting as a shadow Secretary of State, which I assume there would be various people within the Trump administration would say, no, he really wasn't. You know, that's one set of facts. But what we're starting to hear now is that the Southern District of New York is investigating a whole bunch of other contacts that he had with a bunch of people in the Ukraine. And those behaviors are not going to be easily talked away or spun away.
Because there's financial evidence?
Exactly. I mean, and not only that, the evidence is held by third parties. You can stonewall all you want if you're Mr. Giuliani. But as you can see from what you were talking about earlier, you can get the documents from somewhere else.
Yeah, you make such an interesting point because so many political battles are debates over who says what. And you're saying the evidence is more powerful than anyone's self-interested defense or stonewalling. This story we just crossed the wire from the Journal says, quote, Giuliani is the, quote, primary focus of the new subpoena against this former congressman. Giuliani has, quote, denied wrongdoing and said he has no indication that he's being investigated. It doesn't seem to matter whether he knows. It appears that other people know, confirmed by multiple folks. What does it tell you the office that you used to work, SDNY, is subpoenaing former Congressman Sessions to get at Giuliani?
I think they're acting slowly and deliberately, which is exactly the way you would expect them to act, right? Which is to say, okay, we're going to look at the whole universe of potential crimes. We're not looking at any one particular narrative. And the minute we find something of interest, we're going to follow that path. We're going to follow multiple paths. There's no reason to believe that Mr. Sessions is the only person who has received a subpoena. We just heard about that right now. Mm-hmm. We would expect, I would expect the Southern District of New York to have served, basically grand jury to have served bank subpoenas on multiple banks. You wouldn't expect them to stop with just one bank. And from there, it's sort of like a web, right? And it sort of expands. And one thing to keep in mind, and this is different from the impeachment inquiry. Impeachment, there is a benefit to the House that we get this drip, 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 nice drip of information that we hear about, and it moves quickly. A criminal investigation is different, right? Particularly when it's before the grand jury. It's secret. Right now, obviously things come out, but for the most part, it's secret. And that's really beneficial to the government because it's that secrecy that protects your evidence. That protects against dispoliation of evidence and at least protects potentially against obstruction. Because if nobody knows where the government's going, right, where those subpoenas are going, it's harder to destroy evidence.
So how do you explain, and this is something that a lot of people have been exploring, you worked at SDNY. Mm-hmm. Tough prosecutors?
Definitely.
Usually win their cases?
Yes.
Statistically, they do, yeah.
Right.
How do you explain Giuliani putting himself in a position where the office that he knows so well, and he knows how tough they are, and he knows how much they succeed, is under that glare? I mean, how does he get out from under this, and how did he make that mistake?
So there's this remarkable amount of psychology out there that asks, why do people in high places do really dumb things? And there's a lot of work out there that suggests it's not something that comes all at once, right? It's something you make a little bit of, it's called ethical fading, right? You tell yourself, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I'm just making a little move here. I'm just doing something that's a little unethical, a little wrongful. And then you convince yourself after you've moved the line that you can make another move that's a little unethical, a little more wrongful.
And do you think he's on the wrong side of the line now?
I think we're likely to find out. I'd like to wait and see everything that comes out. Certainly what I've seen horrifies me. But I think we're going to see a lot more.
Yeah, let me bring Robert Reich back in. You've been patiently a part of this, but listening to Miriam's very interesting analysis, including the lawyerly statement that she'd like to wait for all the evidence, but she is also horrified by the available evidence. Walk us through the larger part of this in the administration, Robert, because when we hear that John Bolton was moved to this degree, to go to the lawyers for the National Security Council, tell his aide to do that, to go say this is a drug deal. What does that tell you about the level of concern before any of this was public?
Well, not only, John Bolton, let's be clear, John Bolton is not a hero of the Democrats or liberals. John Bolton is about as conservative as they come. But conservative liberal is not really the issue here. Neither is Republican Democrat. The issue is what's going to happen to a president that is freelancing with a rogue Secretary of State, and everybody is beginning to ask, follow the money. This is what we heard in the Nixon Watergate.
Sure, I guess I'm curious about your view of the Bolton thing, though.
And Bolton, Bolton is somebody who is close to the president hired. And for Bolton to say this is going to be a hand grenade that could blow up, be careful, that is very, very significant because Bolton has seen exactly what's going on. Bolton also has named other people inside the White House. The chief of staff is part of what might be a conspiracy. Bolton names him as part of something that's going on that could blow up in everybody's face. Ari, I think just stepping back from all of this, my only concern here, honestly, is that there is already evidence. We already know that the President of the United States, and there is a transcript showing that he tried to get dirt on a potential opponent from a foreign power, and we also know that that is impeachable. That's an impeachable offense. The more complex this becomes, the more we go into Rudolph Giuliani and John Bolton and all these other characters, it builds up a case potentially for impeachment, but you already have an impeachment case. You don't want to confuse it. You don't want to confuse the public. If you want to have any prayer of getting 20 Republican senators to back impeachment, that's the number you need if every Democratic senator goes along with it. You've got to have a public that understands exactly what happened.
You're speaking about the challenge posed to your Democratic Party and to what Pelosi does, and we're going to hear from her when she steps out on this podium within the hour, we're told, by the House. Of course, that's a different project than the project we're doing here, which is gathering all the evidence. So the evidence on Giuliani, what happens in this probe, whether it ultimately exculpates or incriminates, is something we're doing, although I understand it's different than the project of Democrats trying to tell the simplest story. I'm going to fit in a break. Miriam, the final question I have, though, on where we go from here is, based on your knowledge of SDNY and the type of case this is on Giuliani, are we talking weeks, months, years? Some cases are complex. I would note the Cohen case, SDNY moved very swiftly on.
So I wouldn't expect years. I think the difference between weeks and months might be a case of what do you find? What additionally do you find? Right? The more you find, the more you're going to want to make sure that you get all your ducks in a row.
But if you say not years, based on this being a case about things Giuliani's discussed publicly, financial documents around these individuals, several of them already indicted, ballpark, I'm not going to hold you to it, but ballpark, you're talking about under 6 months, they either move or don't move on other subjects in the probe.
With some caveats, because you might want to see if there really was a chance that the president would be removed under impeachment. You might say, I'm going to put this on hold and wait for that all to sort of resolve. But that being said, right, because you might be worried about something like pardons, right? So putting that aside, okay, putting that aside.
Well, who's bringing up pardons? Now you're so careful, you're bringing up pardons.
No, but I'm saying is if that's what you're worried about, right, if you're thinking I want to preserve my case, I don't have to worry about my statute of limitations because this all took place within what?
But, you know, it's funny you mention that, and you have so much knowledge about this. Donald Trump hasn't pardoned almost anybody directly in these issues, Arpaio and others, but not anyone in any of this. You think the first conflicted, sort of potentially appealable type pardon would be Giuliani?
I wouldn't in any way suggest it, but to him. But that being said,
you wouldn't recommend it.
No, I would never recommend it, but I would be worried about it. I'm saying if you're asking me what do the prosecutors do, and if I'm a prosecutor and I have all my ducks in a row, I still might think, I should wait and see where all this goes for a little bit.
It's fascinating to hear you lay that out, having served in SDNY, and to listen to both of you, Robert and Miriam, given your extensive experience on a night when we're waiting on the Speaker of the House to discuss the potential impeachment of the president, and we're hearing former members of Congress have been subpoenaed in the Giuliani probe, and Mr. Giuliani says he's going to, of course, fight these subpoenas. My special thanks to Miriam and Robert. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.